A man buys a woman's freedom at an auction, but she doesn't want to be saved. Under the brutal sun of the Wild West, Rhett Calloway, a cowboy haunted by his past, makes the most impulsive decision of his life. Ayla, an unbroken Apache woman, shows no fear despite her chains. Two strangers, neither trusting the other, bound by a transaction neither fully understands. In a forgotten canyon where hope died long ago, they'll either destroy each other or discover that redemption doesn't come from running. It comes from standing your ground. Drop a like and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The auction block stood in the center of Domingo Springs like a rotting tooth, weathered gray wood baking under a sun that didn't forgive and didn't forget. Rhett Calloway leaned against the rail outside Morrison's saloon, hat pulled low, watching the crowd gather with the kind of sick fascination a man feels watching a rattlesnake coil. He'd told himself he was just passing through, told himself he wouldn't stop, told himself a lot of things lately that turned out to be lies. The auctioneer was a fat man named Geddes, sweat staining half-moons under his arms, voice carrying across the square like he was selling livestock, which Rhett supposed he was. Strong back, good teeth, probably breeds well if you're patient with her, Geddes was saying, gesturing at the woman on the platform like she was a mule he'd personally vouched for. Rhett should have looked away, should have finished his whiskey, mounted his horse, and put this dying town in his dust. But he didn't. The woman stood perfectly still in a way that made stillness look like defiance. She wore a torn cotton dress that had once been white, now the color of adobe and old blood. Her wrists were bound in front of her with rope thick enough to tie down a horse. Dark hair hung past her shoulders, tangled but not defeated. And her eyes, even from 30 feet away, Rhett could see they weren't looking down. They were looking straight out, unblinking, at nothing and everything. Do I hear 20? Silence. The kind that stretches out awkward and mean. Rhett's fingers tightened on his glass. 15 then. Come on, gentlemen, this is a fair price for 50. The word came out of Rhett's mouth before his brain caught up with it. The crowd turned. Geddes blinked, suddenly attentive as a hunting dog on a scent. $50. Geddes' smile was all teeth and no warmth. Well now, $50 for the lady. Do I hear 60? Rhett pushed off the rail and walked toward the platform, boot heels loud against packed dirt. Every eye in the square followed him. He knew some of these faces, knew them enough to know he didn't want to. You hear 60, Geddes? Rhett stopped at the base of the platform, looking up at the auctioneer, not at the woman. Not yet. Or are we done? Geddes licked his lips. His eyes darted to a man in a black coat standing near the general store, some territorial official whose name Rhett didn't care to know. The man gave a slight shrug. Sold, Geddes said, bringing his hand down like a judge's gavel. To the gentleman for $50, cash only. Rhett reached into his coat and pulled out a roll of bills, counted them slowly, making everyone wait. When he handed them up, Geddes snatched them fast like Rhett might change his mind. Pleasure doing business, Geddes said, already moving to untie the woman's wrists from the post. She's all yours. Not responsible for any trouble she causes, mind you. I'll keep that in mind. Geddes freed the rope from the post, but left her wrists bound. He gave the rope a little tug, and the woman stepped forward without stumbling, moving with the kind of grace that comes from pride, not practice. Geddes thrust the end of the rope toward Rhett like a lead. Rhett took it. The rope felt heavier than it should have. The woman's eyes met his for the first time. They were dark brown, almost black, and they looked at him the way you'd look at a coyote circling your campfire, wary, measuring, unafraid. Can you walk? He asked. She didn't answer, didn't blink. Probably doesn't speak English, someone muttered from the crowd. Laughter followed, low and ugly. Rhett turned slowly, scanning the faces until the laughter died out like a campfire doused. Then he looked back at the woman. My horse is over there, he said, nodding toward the hitching post. We're leaving. He started walking. The rope went taut. He stopped, looked back. She hadn't moved. You planning to make this difficult? He asked quietly. Her head tilted slightly like she was considering the question. Then she took a step forward. Then another. Rhett turned and kept walking, and she followed 3 paces behind, the rope slack between them. His horse, a gray gelding named Ash, nickered when Rhett approached. He stuffed the end of the rope in his saddlebag, couldn't bring himself to hold it like a leash, and swung into the saddle. The woman stood beside the horse, waiting. "Can you ride?" Rhett asked. She looked up at him, still silent. Rhett let out a breath through his nose and held out his hand. She stared at it for a long moment, then placed her bound hands in his. Her skin was warm, rougher than he'd expected. He pulled, and she stepped into the stirrup and settled behind him on the saddle like she'd done it before. The ride out of Domingo Springs took 10 minutes, felt like an hour. Rhett could feel every eye on his back, could hear the whispers starting already. He didn't care. He'd stopped caring about his reputation around the same time he'd stopped caring about most things. The canyon was 8 miles south, a gash in the red earth that ran deep and narrow, carved by a river that had mostly given up. Rhett's land, if you could call it that, sat on the eastern edge, 100 acres of scrub brush, rock, and stubbornness. There was a cabin he'd built himself, a barn that leaned slightly west, and a well that still gave water if you were patient. He'd been here 2 years, hadn't planted anything, hadn't fixed the fence, hadn't done much of anything except wake up, work until his hands bled, and fall asleep too tired to dream. The woman didn't speak the entire ride, didn't hold on to him either, just sat behind him, balanced, her bound hands resting on her lap. When they reached the cabin, Rhett dismounted and turned to help her down. She was already on the ground, standing in the dust, looking at the canyon stretching out behind the property like it was an old friend. Rhett pulled a knife from his belt. The woman's eyes flicked to it, but she didn't move. "I'm going to cut the rope," he said slowly. "Understand?" No response. He reached for her wrists. She let him. The blade was sharp. The rope fell away in 2 quick cuts. Red marks circled her wrists where the hemp had dug in. She rubbed them absently, still looking past him toward the canyon. "There's water in the barrel by the door," Rhett said, pointing. "Food inside if you're hungry. You can sleep in the cabin. I'll take the barn." She turned to look at him then, really look at him, and Rhett had the uncomfortable feeling of being seen in a way he hadn't been in a long time. "Why?" she said. Her voice was low, unaccented, clear as creek water. Rhett blinked. "You do speak English. Why did you buy me?" He opened his mouth, closed it, didn't have an answer that made sense, even to himself. "Seemed like the thing to do," he finally said. Her expression didn't change. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." They stood there in the fading light, 2 strangers in the middle of nowhere, the canyon wind picking up and stirring the dust between them. "My name is Ayla," she said. "Rhett." She nodded once, then walked past him toward the cabin. She didn't look back. Rhett stood in the yard until the sun dropped below the rim of the canyon and the sky turned the color of a healing bruise. Then he unsaddled Ash, fed him, and made his way to the barn. Sleep didn't come easy. It never did. The next morning, Rhett woke to the smell of coffee. He sat up fast, hand going instinctively to the revolver he kept under his bedroll. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the barn wood, painting stripes across the hay-strewn floor. The smell was unmistakable, strong, bitter, real. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside. The air was already warming, the kind of dry heat that settled into your bones. Ayla was crouched by a small fire she'd built in a ring of stones near the well, a dented pot balanced on the flames. She looked up when he approached but didn't speak. "You made coffee," Rhett said. "Brilliant observation." "You had beans." She went back to watching the pot. Rhett scratched the back of his neck, feeling off balance. "Didn't think you'd still be here. Where would I go?" "Fair point." She poured coffee into a tin cup and held it out. Rhett took it, their fingers not quite touching. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint and tasted like the best thing he'd had in months. "Thank you," he said. Ayla poured herself a cup and stood, looking out toward the canyon. "This land is dying." Rhett followed her gaze. She wasn't wrong. The scrub was brown, the soil cracked, the few cottonwoods near the creek barely clinging to life. "Yeah," he said, "I know. Why do you stay? Why do you ask so many questions?" She glanced at him, and for the first time, something almost like amusement crossed her face. "You bought me. I didn't buy you. I think I'm owed a few questions." Rhett couldn't argue with that. "I stay because I don't have anywhere else to go," he said after a moment, And because leaving's easier than fixing things. Ayla sipped her coffee, considering him. You're not a rancher. What gave it away? Your hands. She nodded toward them. They're scarred, but not from ranch work, and you move like someone who spent more time running than building. Rhett looked down at his hands. She was right. The scars were old, some from rope burns, some from fights, one long one across his palm from a knife fight in Silver City he'd barely walked away from. You're observant, he said. I'm alive, she replied. Same thing. They stood in silence for a while, drinking coffee, watching the sun climb higher. There's work to do if you're staying, Rhett finally said. Fence needs mending, well needs cleaning, barn's got a hole in the roof. I'm not your worker. Didn't say you were. But if you're here, might as well make yourself useful. Ayla set down her cup and turned to face him fully. I'll work. But not because you tell me to. Because this land deserves better than what you're giving it. Rhett felt something twist in his chest. Shame, maybe, or anger. Hard to tell the difference anymore. Fine, he said. Fine, she echoed. And that was how it started. The first week was careful and quiet. They worked on opposite ends of the property, circling each other like dogs unsure of territory. Rhett fixed the fence posts along the southern border. Ayla cleared rocks from what used to be a garden plot behind the cabin. They spoke in short sentences. Practical things. Need more wire. Water's low. Storm coming. Rhett learned she was stronger than she looked. Watched her carry a load of firewood that would have made him grunt without so much as a grimace. Learned she knew plants, could point to a scrubby weed and tell him it was good for tea, good for wounds, good for keeping snakes away. Learned she didn't sleep much. Sometimes he'd wake in the middle of the night and see her silhouette against the cabin window, or catch her walking the rim of the canyon in the pre-dawn gray. She learned he was a decent shot, but a terrible cook. That he talked to his horse more than he talked to people. That he carried something heavy he wouldn't name. On the 8th day, the well ran dry. Rhett stood over it, staring down into darkness, jaw tight. Hell! Ayla appeared beside him, peering down. When did you last dig it deeper? Never. She looked at him. You've been here 2 years and never maintained the well? I didn't. He stopped. Didn't have a good excuse. I'll ride into town. Get supplies. Or you could dig, she said. I don't know how to dig a well. I do. Rhett turned to stare at her. You know how to dig a well. My people dug wells in places where water didn't want to be found. This canyon has water. You're just not looking deep enough. Your people, Rhett repeated, and immediately regretted it when her expression shuddered. Yes, she said quietly. My people. He wanted to ask. Wanted to know where she'd come from, how she'd ended up on that auction block, what had happened to the people she spoke of in past tense. But the look on her face told him that door was closed, and prying it open would cost more than he had to spend. All right, he said, teach me. They spent the next 3 days hauling out mud and rock, Rhett in the well with a rope around his waist, Ayla working the pulley. His shoulders screamed, his back felt like someone had taken a hammer to it. But on the 4th day, water seeped up through the bottom, slow at first, then stronger. When Rhett climbed out, covered head to toe in mud, Ayla was smiling, actually smiling. See, she said, not dead yet. Rhett looked at the water already starting to pool in the bucket, then at Ayla, then back at the water. No, he said. Not yet. That night she cooked. Some kind of stew made from dried meat, wild onions she'd found growing near the creek, and something green he didn't recognize. It tasted better than anything he'd made in 2 years. Where'd you learn to cook like this? He asked. My mother. She didn't look up from her bowl. She said food is prayer. You put care in, you get strength out. Rhett chewed slowly, turning that over. Your mother still alive? No. The words sat between them like a stone. I'm sorry, Rhett said. Ayla shrugged. Everyone's sorry. Doesn't bring anyone back. No, it doesn't. She looked up then, studying him. You lost someone. It wasn't a question. Rhett set down his bowl. Yeah. Recently? 4 years ago. Feels like yesterday. Feels like forever. Ayla nodded slowly. That's how it works. Grief doesn't follow time the way living does. You sound like you know. I lost everyone, she said simply. Not all at once. That might have been easier, one by one, until I was the only one left. Rhett didn't know what to say to that, didn't think there was anything to say. The man I lost, he finally said. His name was Caleb, my brother. Younger by 2 years, followed me into every stupid thing I ever did, and I did a lot of stupid things. What happened? I led him somewhere I shouldn't have, got greedy, got stupid, got him killed. Rhett's voice came out flat, factual. He'd told the story so many times in his head it had lost its shape. Been running ever since. Running doesn't work, Ayla said. I noticed. She stood, gathering the bowls. You can't outrun what's inside you. I tried. Spent a year trying, still ended up on that auction block. How'd you... Rhett stopped himself. How did I end up there? She walked to the basin, rinsed the bowls. I was caught trying to cross into Mexico. Alone. They said I was abandoned property. Territory law. They can sell you for that. That's not a law. That's an excuse. Law and excuse look the same when you're the one in chains. She dried her hands on a cloth. But you're right. It was an excuse, just like this canyon is an excuse for you to hide. Rhett felt anger flare hot in his chest. I'm not hiding. No? Ayla turned to face him. Then what are you doing? I'm trying to survive. Surviving isn't living. It's close enough. Is it? She crossed her arms. Because from where I'm standing, you're doing the same thing I was, waiting to disappear. Only difference is you built a cabin first. Rhett stood up, chair scraping loud against the floor. You don't know anything about me. I know you bought a woman at an auction because it was easier than facing whatever you're running from. I know you live in a barn when there's a perfectly good cabin because you don't think you deserve comfort. I know you haven't planted a single seed in 2 years because planting means staying, and staying means you might have to forgive yourself. Her voice was steady, relentless. So tell me I'm wrong. Rhett's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to yell. Wanted to tell her she had no right. Wanted to storm out into the night and keep riding until he hit ocean. But he didn't. Because she wasn't wrong. I can't forgive myself, he said quietly. Caleb's dead because of me. That doesn't just go away because I want it to. No, Ayla agreed. It doesn't. But it also doesn't mean you have to die with him. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Rhett turned away, gripping the back of the chair, staring at the floor. I don't know how to do anything else. Then learn. Ayla's voice softened. That's what I'm doing. That's why I stayed. He looked at her. Why did you stay? She was quiet for a long moment. Because you cut the rope, she finally said. You could have kept me tied up, could have treated me like what they told you I was. But you didn't. You asked if I could walk. You asked if I could ride. Small things. But they mattered. They shouldn't matter. That's basic decency. Basic decency is rare. She moved to the door, paused with her hand on the frame. I'm going to sleep. You should too. Tomorrow we start planting. Planting what? Everything. She left him standing there, the cabin suddenly too quiet. Rhett stood for a while, then walked outside. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like somebody had spilled salt. The canyon breathed below, dark and deep. He thought about Caleb, about the last time he'd seen him alive, grinning like a fool, saying, Don't worry, Rhett, we'll make it. About the gunshot that still echoed in his nightmares. About the grave he'd dug with his bare hands in hard ground while the sun burned his neck raw. He thought about Ayla, standing on that auction block with her chin up and her eyes forward, refusing to break. He thought about the well they'd dug together, about water rising from dead ground. Maybe, he said to the empty air, to the canyon, to the ghost of his brother. Maybe she's right. The canyon didn't answer, but the wind picked up, rustling through the scrub, and for the first time in 4 years, it didn't sound like goodbye. It sounded like maybe. Quote, Morning came too early and too bright. Rhett woke to Ayla already moving around outside, gathering things. When he emerged from the barn, she had a pile of items laid out. A rusted hoe, a shovel, several tin cans filled with what looked like seeds. Where'd those come from, he asked. I've been collecting them. She held up a can. Corn. Found some growing wild near the creek. These... She indicated another can. Squash. And these are beans. You've been planning this. I've been hoping for this. She stood, brushing dirt from her hands. There's a difference. They worked through the morning, breaking ground that hadn't been broken in years, maybe longer. The soil was hard, stubborn. Rhett's shoulders protested with every swing of the hoe, but Ayla worked beside him, relentless, and somehow that made it easier. Around midday, she stopped and walked to the edge of the property, staring up at the sky. What? Rhett called. Rain's coming. He looked up. The sky was blue, cloudless. You can tell that how? I can smell it, feel it. She closed her eyes. It's coming. 2 days, maybe 3. If you say so. I do. They kept working. By sunset, they'd planted half the garden plot. Rhett's hands were blistered, his back on fire, but he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Tired, in a good way. Tired like he'd done something that mattered. That night, Ayla made more of the stew and they ate outside, sitting on the porch steps Rhett had built but never used. Tell me about your people, Rhett said. Ayla went still. Why? Because you asked about mine. Seems fair. She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, we were canyon people, lived in the high places where the rock meets the sky, grew food in terraces, caught water in cisterns carved into stone. We'd been there longer than anyone could remember. What happened? What always happens? People came who wanted the land. We were in the way. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Rhett heard the weight beneath it. They came in winter, burned the food stores, poisoned the water. The ones who survived scattered. I was with my mother. We walked for months trying to find others, found some, lost them. Then it was just us, then just me. How old were you? 16. Jesus. She couldn't be more than 20 now. I'm sorry, Rhett said and meant it. Like I said, everyone's sorry. She set down her bowl. But you know what's strange? I don't hate them, the ones who did it. I hate what they did. I hate what they took. But hating them would mean carrying them with me forever, and I've carried enough. Rhett turned that over. How do you let go of something like that? You don't let go. You choose where to put it. She looked at him. You can put it in anger, let it burn you down. Or you can put it in the ground, let it grow into something else. That why you wanted to plant? Partly. Also because I'm tired of eating your cooking. Rhett actually laughed. Short, surprised, rusty from disuse, but real. Ayla smiled. There, that's better. What is? You, laughing. You should do it more. Haven't had much reason to. Then make reasons. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out. Rhett found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. The constant hum of guilt and grief still there, but quieter. Background noise instead of a scream. 2 days, Ayla said, looking at the sky again. The rain will come in 2 days. And if it doesn't, then I'll call it myself. Rhett glanced at her. You can do that? My grandmother could. She taught me. Never tried it alone before, though. She stood, stretching. Guess we'll see. She went inside. Rhett stayed on the porch, looking out at the dark canyon, at the plot of land they'd broken and planted, at the future he hadn't let himself imagine. All right, Caleb, he said quietly. Maybe I'm staying. Maybe it's time. The wind answered, warm and steady. 2 days later, the clouds rolled in. The storm built slowly, clouds stacking on the western horizon like stones, gray turning to black. Ayla stood in the middle of the planted garden, barefoot, arms raised, speaking words Rhett didn't understand. The language was old, consonants hard and vowels long, rhythm like water over rocks. Rhett watched from the porch, uncertain whether to be skeptical or awed. The wind picked up. The air thickened, electric. Ayla's voice rose, stronger, calling to something Rhett couldn't see but could feel building in his chest, in the ground beneath his feet. Thunder cracked, low and rolling. Then the rain came. Not a drizzle, not a shower. A downpour, heavy and sudden, drumming against the roof, soaking into the thirsty ground. Ayla stood in it, head tilted back, laughing, actually laughing, as water streamed down her face and plastered her hair to her skull. Rhett stepped off the porch into the rain, letting it soak him, wash away the dust and sweat and accumulated weight of the day. He walked to where Ayla stood, and she turned to him, still laughing, eyes bright. "You called it," he said, shouting over the rain. "I told you." "How?" "Does it matter?" No, it didn't. They stood together in the rain until it slowed to a steady fall, then moved to the porch, dripping and grinning like idiots. "Your grandmother would be proud," Rhett said. Ayla's smile faltered just a little. "I hope so." They watched the rain feed the garden, puddles forming in the low spots, the dry earth drinking deep. "This land wasn't dead," Ayla said softly. "Just waiting for someone to care." Rhett looked at her, rain-soaked, alive, entirely herself, and felt something shift in him, something old and rusted cracking open. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For staying, for this." He gestured at the garden, the rain, everything. "For not letting me disappear." Ayla met his eyes. "You did the same for me." The rain fell, the canyon breathed, and for the first time in 4 years, Rhett Calloway thought maybe, just maybe, he could build something instead of running from the ashes. But that night, as the storm intensified into something fiercer, darker, meaner than either of them expected, the real test would come. And survival, Rhett would learn, required more than just deciding to stay. It required trusting someone else to stand with you when everything tried to wash you away. The rain that had started as a blessing turned vicious by midnight. What began as steady drumming on the cabin roof became a roar, wind screaming through the canyon like something wounded and angry. Rhett woke to the sound of wood creaking, the whole structure shuddering under the force of the storm. He rolled out of his bedroll in the barn and pushed open the door. Rain slammed into him sideways, cold and sharp as glass. Lightning cracked across the sky, turning everything white for half a second. And in that flash, he saw the creek, swollen to 3 times its normal size, churning brown and fast, already lapping at the eastern fence posts. "Hell," he muttered, pulling his hat down tight. He grabbed his coat and ran toward the cabin, boots splashing through water that was ankle-deep in places where the ground had nowhere left to drain. Ayla met him at the door, already dressed, hair tied back. Her face was tight with worry. "The garden," she said. "Forget the garden. We need to get to higher ground. I'm not leaving it." "Ayla, I spent 4 days planting those seeds. They're the last ones I have from my people's land. I'm not letting them wash away." Rhett grabbed her shoulder, forcing her to look at him. "If that creek jumps its banks, this whole area floods. I've seen it before. We need to move now." She jerked away from his grip. "Then help me save what we can." Before he could argue, she was out the door and running toward the garden plot. Rhett swore, loud and creative, and followed. The wind tried to knock them both over. Rain turned the world into a gray blur, visibility down to maybe 10 feet. Ayla dropped to her knees at the edge of the garden and started digging with her bare hands, scooping up mud and seeds, shoving them into her pockets, into the front of her shirt, anywhere she could. Rhett knelt beside her and did the same. His fingers numb within seconds, mud caking under his nails. It was pointless. The water was already pooling in the furrows they'd dug, seeds floating away faster than they could gather them. But he kept digging because she was digging, and leaving her out here alone wasn't something he could do. A sound cut through the storm, deep, grinding, wrong. Rhett's head snapped up. Upstream, maybe a quarter mile, something dark was moving through the water. Not flowing, tumbling. A cottonwood, roots and all, ripped free by the flood, rolling end over end straight toward them. "Move!" Rhett shouted, grabbing Ayla around the waist and hauling her backward. They scrambled up the slope toward the cabin just as the tree hit the garden plot with a sound like a cannon going off. Branches splintered, mud exploded upward. When Rhett looked back, half the garden was gone, churned into formless soup. Ayla made a sound, not quite a cry, not quite a gasp, and Rhett felt it in his chest like a punch. "Come on," he said, pulling her toward the cabin. "We can't stay here." She let him lead her inside. They stood dripping in the doorway, breathing hard, watching through the window as the storm tore apart everything they'd built. The fence posts went next, snapping like kindling. Then part of the barn roof peeled away, vanishing into the darkness. "I should have listened to you," Ayla said quietly. "You were trying to save something that mattered. Nothing wrong with that." It's gone anyway. Not all of it. Rhett nodded toward her mud-caked hands, her bulging pockets. You saved some. She looked down at her hands like she'd forgotten they were there. Slowly, carefully, she emptied her pockets onto the table. Maybe 24 seeds, coated in mud, but whole. She stared at them for a long moment, then closed her eyes. It's not enough, she whispered. It's more than nothing. Lightning struck close enough that the thunder came instant and deafening. The cabin shook. Ayla flinched and Rhett moved without thinking, putting himself between her and the window. We need to get away from the glass, he said. They moved to the back corner of the cabin, the most sheltered spot, and sat with their backs against the wall. The storm raged on, relentless. Hours passed. The water kept rising. Rhett could hear it now, sloshing against the cabin's foundation, creeping higher. Tell me about Caleb, Ayla said suddenly. Rhett glanced at her. Why? Because I need to think about something other than drowning. And because you never talk about him except to say you got him killed. Rhett leaned his head back against the wall. Talking about Caleb hurt in a way that felt both sharp and dull, like an old wound that never quite healed. He was stubborn, Rhett started. Thought he knew everything at 22. Drove me crazy. But he was also loyal, funny, had this laugh that sounded like a donkey brain, and he knew it, so he'd do it on purpose just to make people smile. Sounds like a good brother. He was. Better than I deserved. Rhett's throat tightened. We were running a job down in Silver City. Simple thing, or supposed to be. Stage robbery. I'd done a dozen of them, but I got greedy. Driver said there was extra payroll in the strongbox, twice what we expected. I should have known it was a setup. Ayla didn't say anything, just waited. They were waiting for us, Rhett continued. Sheriff and 6 deputies hiding in the rocks. We rode right into it. Caleb saw them first, shouted a warning, took a bullet meant for me. His voice cracked. I got him on his horse, tried to run, but he was bleeding too bad. Died before we made it 2 miles. And you've been running ever since. Yeah. From what? The law? From myself. Rhett rubbed his face. The law doesn't care anymore. It was 4 years ago and I never pulled the trigger. But I care. I got him into it. I pushed for that job. I ignored every sign that said don't. So yeah, I've been running from that. Ayla shifted closer, close enough that their shoulders touched. You know what I think? What? I think Caleb wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life in a barn, punishing yourself. I think he'd want you to live. You didn't know him. No, but I know what it's like to be the one left behind. And I know that the people we lose don't want us to disappear with them. They want us to carry them forward. There's a difference. Rhett looked at her. Water dripped from her hair, her clothes. She looked exhausted, half drowned, and still somehow stronger than anyone he'd ever met. How do you do it? He asked. How do you keep going when you've lost everything? I haven't lost everything. I'm still here. So are you. She held up the seeds she'd saved, clutched in her palm. So are these. As long as we're here, it's not over. The cabin shuddered again. A horrible cracking sound came from somewhere outside. Wood splitting, something heavy falling. Rhett stood and moved to the window. The water was halfway up the door now, and the current was strong enough that debris kept slamming into the cabin's side. We might have to get on the roof, he said. Can we? If we have to, yeah, there's a crawl space hatch. He turned back to her, but if the cabin goes, we go with it. Creek's too fast to swim. Ayla stood, tucking the seeds carefully into an inner pocket of her dress. Then we don't let the cabin go. Not sure we get a say in that. We always get a say. She moved to the door and pressed her hand against it, closing her eyes. The storm's breaking. Can you feel it? Rhett didn't feel anything except cold and wet and tired, but he didn't argue. If she wanted to hope, he wasn't going to take that from her. They waited. The water rose another few inches, then seemed to hold. The wind began to ease, the rain slackening from downpour to heavy shower. By the time dawn came, gray and waterlogged, the worst had passed. Rhett opened the door and stepped out into a world transformed. The garden was gone, completely erased. The barn stood, but barely. Half the roof missing, one wall caved in. The fence was matchsticks. The creek had retreated to its banks, but the land around it was scoured clean, stripped down to bedrock in places. Ayla stepped out beside him, surveyed the damage, and said nothing. We can rebuild, Rhett said. I've got tools, lumber in town if we need it. It's not the same. No, but it's something. She looked down at her hands, still caked with dried mud, then out at the ruined land. I need to walk, she said abruptly. Want company? No, I need to be alone for a while. Rhett nodded. He understood that need. Don't go far. Ground's unstable. She walked toward the canyon rim without answering. Rhett watched until she was a small figure against the red rock, then turned to assess what could be salvaged. The barn was first. He spent the morning pulling away debris, stacking anything usable. His muscles screamed. His hands were raw. But the work felt necessary, gave him something to do other than think about how close they'd come to losing everything. Midday, he noticed Ayla hadn't come back. He walked to the canyon rim, scanning, found her 100 yards out, sitting on a flat boulder, staring at the horizon. He approached slowly, making noise so he wouldn't startle her. You all right? He called. She didn't turn. I thought I could make it work. Thought if I just tried hard enough, gave enough, this place could be home. Rhett sat down beside her on the boulder. It still can be. Can it? She finally looked at him. Her eyes were red but dry. Every time I try to plant roots, something rips them up. My home, my people. Now this. The storm wasn't personal. Wasn't it? Feels personal. Feels like the world's telling me to stop trying. The world doesn't talk, Rhett said. It just does what it does. Rain falls. Rivers flood. People die. He paused. But people also survive. Plant, build, keep going even when it doesn't make sense. Is that what you're doing? Keeping going? Trying to. Ayla was quiet for a long time. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals, hunting. The canyon stretched out below them, scarred and ancient and indifferent. My grandmother used to say the land remembers, Ayla said eventually. Every footstep, every seed, every life lived on it. She said that's why you have to treat it with respect. Because it's not just dirt, it's memory. You believe that? I want to. She picked up a pebble, turned it over in her fingers. I want to believe that what we do matters, that the seeds I plant will grow, that the people I've lost aren't just gone, but part of something bigger. They are, Rhett said. You carry them. That makes them part of everything you do. She looked at him, surprised. When did you get wise? About 5 minutes ago. Don't expect it to last. A small smile tugged at her mouth. Not much, but real. We should get back. There's work to do. They walked back together, the silence between them comfortable now. Rhett found himself watching her from the corner of his eye, the way she moved over the rough ground without stumbling, the set of her shoulders, the quiet determination in every step. She was right about the land remembering, but he was starting to think people remembered too. Remembered what it felt like to care about something, to build instead of destroy, to trust someone enough to let them see you broken and not flinch away. By evening, they'd cleared most of the debris and started sorting what could be reused. Rhett was pulling nails from a plank when he heard horses. He straightened, hand moving instinctively toward his gun belt. 3 riders were approaching from the east, moving slow and deliberate. Even from a distance, Rhett recognized trouble when he saw it. Ayla, he called. Get inside. She emerged from behind the cabin, saw the riders, and went still. Who are they? Don't know, but I don't like the look of them. The riders stopped about 20 yards out. The one in front was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a black coat and a badge pinned to his chest. Not sheriff's tin, something territorial. The 2 behind him were younger, leaner, with the hard eyes of men who'd seen violence and liked it. Help you? Rhett called. The big man dismounted, taking his time. Name's Coleman, Territorial Land Office. This the Calloway property? It is. And you're Rhett Calloway? Last I checked. Coleman's eyes shifted to Ayla, lingered. That the Apache woman you bought in Domingo Springs? Every muscle in Rhett's body went tight. What's it to you? Territorial law says all Apache property needs to be registered, kept in designated areas. Coleman pulled a folded paper from his coat. Got a complaint filed by a Mr. Geddes. Says you bought this woman but never filed the proper documentation. I didn't buy property. I bought a person's freedom. There's a difference. Not according to the law. Rhett took a step forward. Then the law's wrong. One of the younger men moved his hand toward his gun. Coleman held up a hand, stopping him. Easy now, Coleman said. I'm not here to cause trouble, just to inform you that the woman needs to come with us for proper registration. Once the paperwork's filed, you can have her back. She's not a thing you file paperwork on. The territory says different. Ayla stepped forward, putting herself between Rhett and the riders. I'll go, she said quietly. The hell you will, Rhett said. She turned to look at him, her expression calm but her eyes urgent. It's fine. I'll go. They'll do their paperwork, and I'll come back. You don't know that. And you don't know what happens if you fight this. She touched his arm, just briefly. Let me go. Don't make this worse. Coleman smiled, thin and satisfied. Smart woman. You should listen to her, Calloway. Rhett's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Every instinct screamed at him to reach for his gun, to tell Coleman and his men to get off his land or get buried in it. But Ayla's hand was on his arm, steady, and her eyes were saying, trust me, and he didn't know what else to do. How long? He asked. Couple days, maybe. Week, at most. And I'm supposed to just believe you'll bring her back? I'm a territorial officer. My word's good. Rhett almost laughed. He'd met men like Coleman before, badges and authority, and not an ounce of honor. But he also knew that fighting 3 armed men while Ayla stood in the crossfire was a good way to get them both killed. 1 week, Rhett said. If she's not back in 1 week, I'm coming to find her. Fair enough? Coleman gestured to Ayla. Come on then. Ayla squeezed Rhett's arm once, then let go and walked toward Coleman's horse. She didn't look back. Rhett watched her mount behind Coleman, watched them turn and ride east, watched until they disappeared into the heat shimmer. Then he stood in the yard of his half-destroyed property and felt the same hollow rage he'd felt 4 years ago, watching Caleb's blood soak into the dirt. He'd failed then. Let someone he cared about get taken from him. He'd be damned if he let it happen again. Rhett went into the cabin and dug through his belongings until he found what he was looking for. A gun belt he hadn't worn in 2 years, the leather still supple, the revolver clean and oiled because some habits you don't break. He strapped it on, checked the chambers, added a box of ammunition to his saddlebag. Then he saddled Ash and rode for Domingo Springs. The town looked the same as it had 2 weeks ago, dusty, tired, mean. Rhett tied Ash outside Morrison's saloon and pushed through the doors. The bartender, a grizzled man named Hank, looked up and recognition flickered across his face. Calloway, heard you caused some excitement at the auction. Need information, Hank. Information costs. Rhett dropped a silver dollar on the bar. Where does Coleman take people he picks up under territorial law? Hank pocketed the coin. Fort Kearns, military outpost 30 miles northeast. They've got holding facilities there for people awaiting transport. Transport where? Reservations, usually. Oklahoma, mostly, unless someone buys them first. Rhett's blood went cold. They're selling people out of a military fort? It's not official, but Coleman's got an arrangement with the quartermaster. Anyone registered as property gets auctioned off to contractors, ranchers, anyone with cash. Hank leaned in. Word of advice? Don't go out there looking for a fight. Coleman's got a lot of friends. You won't win. I'm not looking to win. I'm looking to get someone back. Same thing, in this case. Rhett tossed another dollar on the bar. Get me a bottle of your best whiskey. Planning to drink yourself brave? Planning to trade it for information. Hank pulled down a bottle of decent bourbon and slid it across. Good luck, Calloway. You're going to need it. Rhett rode through the night, pushing Ash hard but not cruelly. The fort loomed out of the darkness around dawn, stone walls, guard towers, the territorial flag hanging limp in the still air. He approached the main gate and was stopped by a young soldier with a rifle. State your business. Name's Rhett Calloway. I'm here to see Coleman. He expecting you? No, but he'll want to talk to me. The soldier looked skeptical but went to check. 5 minutes later, he returned and waved Rhett through. Coleman was in an office near the barracks, sitting behind a desk like he owned the place. He didn't look surprised to see Rhett. Figured you'd show up, Coleman said. Faster than I expected, though. Where is she? Safe, fed, probably sleeping better than she did in that shack of yours. Rhett's hand twitched toward his gun. Coleman noticed, smiled. Easy, Calloway. You shoot me, you'll never get out of here alive. And the woman will end up on a transport to Oklahoma anyway. What do you want? Smart question. Coleman leaned back in his chair. See, I don't actually care about your Apache woman, but I do care about making money. And Geddes is upset you cost him a sale. So here's the deal. You pay me what Geddes would have made off her, say $100, and I'll release her to you. Paperwork filed, all legal. I gave Geddes 50. And he would have gotten 70 from the next bidder if you hadn't interfered. So 100 sounds fair. Rhett didn't have $100. Didn't have close to it. I need time, he said. You've got 3 days. After that, she goes on the transport. Coleman shuffled some papers. And Calloway? Don't try anything stupid. I've got 20 soldiers here who'll back whatever story I tell. You understand? Rhett understood. Understood that Coleman was exactly what he'd thought, a man who wore a badge like a mask and used the law to rob people blind. 3 days, Rhett said. He rode back to Domingo Springs and sold everything he could. His spare saddle, his good rifle, a pair of silver spurs Caleb had won in a card game. By sunset on the second day, he had $60. Not enough. He sat in his cabin that night, staring at the pile of coins and bills, doing math that didn't work no matter how many times he ran it. He could rob someone. He'd done it before. But that would take time he didn't have and would probably get him shot or jailed, which wouldn't help Ayla at all. He looked around the cabin. At the table he'd built, the shelves, the stove he'd hauled in piece by piece, 2 years of his life, everything he owned, and it still wasn't enough. Then his eyes landed on the deed to the property. 100 acres, water rights, a cabin. Worth at least $200 to the right buyer, probably more. He'd bought it for $300 4 years ago, back when he still had money from the robberies, before he'd tried to disappear. It was the only thing he had left that was worth enough. The next morning, Rhett rode into town and found a land speculator named Mercer who'd been trying to buy canyon properties for development. The negotiation took an hour. Mercer drove a hard bargain, knew Rhett was desperate, used it against him. In the end, Rhett walked away with $120 and a bill of sale that gave up every legal claim to the land he'd spent 2 years trying to fix. He felt numb. Not sad, not angry, just empty. By afternoon, he was back at Fort Kearns, dropping the $100 on Coleman's desk. Well now, Coleman said, counting it slowly. Look at that. All here. Release her. Paperwork takes time. Rhett pulled his revolver and pointed it at Coleman's face. Now. Coleman went very still. You're making a mistake. Probably. But I'm done waiting. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Coleman carefully reached into his desk and pulled out a key. She's in the holding building, west side. He tossed the key. Take her and go. But Calloway? You just made an enemy. That's going to cost you. Already has. Rhett found Ayla in a windowless room with 6 other women, all Apache, all silent. She looked up when the door opened and relief flooded her face. You came, she said. Of course I came. He unlocked her chains and led her out. None of the soldiers stopped them, but Rhett felt eyes on them the whole way, felt the weight of what he'd just done pressing down like a stone. They rode double on Ash, Ayla's arms around his waist, not speaking until the fort was miles behind them. What did you do? She finally asked. What I had to. Rhett, what did you do? He told her. About selling everything, about the deed, about the land that was no longer his. Ayla's arms tightened around him. You gave up your home. It wasn't a home, just a place I was hiding. Where will we go? That was the question, wasn't it? Rhett didn't have an answer. Didn't have a plan beyond getting Ayla out of that cell. I don't know, he admitted, but we'll figure it out. They rode through the afternoon in silence, heading back toward the canyon even though it wasn't theirs anymore. When they finally saw it in the distance, the sun was setting, painting the rocks red and gold. Ayla slid off the horse and stood looking at the land, at the ruined garden, at the cabin that had almost become home. I'm sorry, she said quietly. For what? For this. For all of it. If I hadn't stayed... Stop. Rhett dismounted and turned her to face him. You didn't make Coleman a bastard. You didn't write the laws. And you didn't ask me to sell the land. I chose that. And I'd choose it again. Why? Because... He stopped, searching for words that wouldn't sound stupid. Because you matter. Because letting them take you would have been the same as letting Caleb die all over again. Because I'm tired of losing people I care about. Ayla stared at him. You care about me. Yeah, I do. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her. I care about you too. Then she kissed him. Not gentle, not tentative, hard and fierce and real, like she was claiming something she had every right to claim. Rhett kissed her back, his hands in her hair, everything he'd been holding in for weeks pouring out in that moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the sky had gone purple with dusk. We should leave, Ayla said, before Mercer comes to take possession. Where do you want to go? She looked out at this canyon, at the land they'd fought for and lost. There's a place my people used to go. Deep in the canyon, where the walls narrow. There are caves there. Water. It's hidden, safe. You want to live in a cave? I want to live somewhere nobody can take from us. She turned back to him. Unless you have a better idea. Rhett thought about it, about running again, finding some new town, some new place to disappear, about going back to the life he'd left behind, drifting, stealing, staying one step ahead of consequence. Then he thought about the way Ayla had stood in the rain, calling down the storm, about her hands in the dirt, planting seeds, about the quiet strength in her eyes when she'd walked toward Coleman's horse without fear. No, he said, I don't have a better idea. They gathered what they could carry, blankets, tools, the seeds Ayla had saved, left the rest for Mercer. Then they rode into the canyon as night fell, following a path only Ayla could see. The caves were exactly where she'd said, tucked into the canyon wall, hidden behind a curtain of rock that made them almost invisible. The largest one was big enough to stand in, deep enough to stay cool, with a spring trickling from a crack in the stone. It's not much, Ayla said. It's ours, Rhett replied. They made camp that night, building a small fire near the cave entrance. Ayla took out the seeds she'd saved and lined them up carefully on a flat rock. We'll plant them tomorrow, she said. There's good soil near the spring. Not much, but enough. Rhett watched her handle the seeds with such care, such reverence, and felt something loosen in his chest. Something that had been clenched tight for 4 years. I'm sorry about your land, Ayla said, not looking at him. Stop apologizing. I'm not. You should be. You gave up everything for me. No. I gave up a deed to some land that was never really mine. You know what I got in return? He waited until she looked at him. A reason to stop running, a reason to stay. That's worth more than 100 acres. Ayla's eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry, just nodded. Okay. Okay. They sat in silence, watching the fire burn down, listening to the canyon breathe around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Another answered. The night was vast and dark and full of uncertainty. But for the first time and longer than Rhett could remember, uncertainty didn't feel like fear. It felt like possibility. The first week in this canyon felt like learning to breathe underwater. Everything was different. The sounds, the light, the way time moved when you weren't measuring it against chores that needed doing on land you owned. Rhett woke each morning to the echo of water dripping somewhere deep in the cave, Ayla already awake beside him, watching the dawn creep across the canyon walls like it was something she'd never seen before. They fell into a rhythm without discussing it. Rhett hunted, rabbits mostly, sometimes a turkey if he got lucky. Ayla foraged, returning with handfuls of plants he didn't recognize, but that she turned into meals that actually tasted like something. She planted the seeds near the spring and soil she carried up from the canyon floor, one handful at a time, building tiny terraces out of rock to hold the earth in place. This is going to take forever, Rhett said, watching her stack stones. Then it takes forever. She didn't look up. We've got time. Do we? That made her pause. She sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. You worried Coleman's going to come looking? Aren't you? He got his money. And we're not worth the effort of tracking into the canyon. She went back to her work. Besides, even if he tried, he wouldn't find us. This place doesn't want to be found. Rhett wasn't so sure about that, but he didn't argue. Instead, he spent his afternoons exploring the canyon, learning its contours, finding the game trails and water sources, the places where the rock walls closed in so tight you had to turn sideways to pass through. He found old markings on some of the cave walls, handprints in red ochre, symbols he couldn't read. When he mentioned them to Ayla, her expression went carefully blank. "My people marked those," she said, "long time ago." "What do they mean?" "They mean we were here, that we existed, that we mattered." She touched one of the handprints, her fingers tracing the outline. "My grandmother brought me here when I was 8, told me that as long as these marks remain, we're not forgotten." Rhett watched her stand there, so small against the ancient stone, and felt the weight of everything she'd lost settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. "You're not forgotten," he said quietly. "No?" She turned to look at him. "Then why does it feel like I'm the only one left who remembers?" He didn't have an answer for that, so he did the only thing he could think of. He took her hand and held it, standing there in the shadow of her ancestors' marks, until the light shifted and it was time to head back. That night, lying on their bedrolls near the fire, Ayla asked him about his family. "You never talk about them," she said. "Your parents, where you're from." Rhett stared at the cave ceiling, at the patterns the firelight made on the stone. "Not much to tell. Mother died when I was young. Fever. Father raised us, me and Caleb, until we were old enough to work. Then he died too, kicked by a horse, stupid, random thing." "How old were you?" 17. Caleb was 15. Rhett shifted, uncomfortable with the memories. "We tried to keep the farm going for about 6 months. Failed spectacularly. Lost it to debts we didn't know Father had. After that, we just drifted. Took jobs where we could find them. Eventually found our way into less legal work. Robbing stages. Among other things." Ayla was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret it? That life? Parts of it? Not all of it." He turned his head to look at her. "I regret getting Caleb killed. I regret not being smarter, more careful. But I don't regret learning how to survive. That's what that life taught me. How to read people, how to think fast, how to stay alive when everything's trying to kill you." "Sounds lonely." It was. He reached out, found her hand in the darkness. "This is better." Her fingers tightened around his. "Yeah, it is." 3 weeks in, they had visitors. Rhett was checking his snares near the canyon mouth when he heard horses. He froze, listening. 2 riders, moving slow, picking their way through the rocks. He recognized the voices before he saw them. Territorial scouts, talking about tracking Apache holdouts. "Heard there might be some hiding in these canyons," one of them said. "Waste of time if you ask me," the other replied. "Anything down there's probably dead already." "Coleman wants them found. Says there's money in it." Rhett's blood went cold. He waited until they passed, then made his way back to the cave as quickly as he could without making noise. Ayla looked up from the fire when he appeared, read his expression, and was on her feet instantly. "Scouts," Rhett said, "looking for Apache. Coleman sent them." "How many?" 2. "But if they're here, there'll be more." Ayla's jaw tightened. "We need to move deeper into the canyon. Or we need to leave entirely." "And go where, Rhett?" "We have no money, no land, no—" "We have our lives. That's more than we'll have if Coleman's men find us." She shook her head stubbornly. "I'm not running anymore. I spent a year running. I'm done." "Ayla, no." Her voice was hard. "This is the last place my people touched. The last place that knows we existed. I'm not abandoning it because some territorial bastard wants to make a profit." "Then what do you suggest?" "We hide. We stay quiet. We wait them out." Rhett wanted to argue, wanted to grab her and put her on a horse and ride until they hit the ocean. But he knew that look in her eyes, knew she'd dig in her heels, and pushing would only make things worse. "All right," he said, "we hide. But we do it smart. No fires during the day, no noise. And if they get close, we run. Deal?" "Deal?" They spent the next 2 days moving everything deeper into the cave system, finding chambers that were nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Ayla showed him passages he'd never seen, tunnels that twisted through the rock like veins, opening into spaces that felt like the belly of the earth itself. On the 3rd day, the scouts came back with 4 more men. Rhett and Ayla watched from a hidden overlook as the men spread out, searching the canyon floor. One of them found the terraces Ayla had built, the tiny sprouting plants. "Someone's been here," the scout called out. "Recent, too." Rhett felt Ayla tense beside him. His hand moved to his gun, but she caught his wrist, shook her head. "Wait." The men searched for an hour, checking caves, looking for tracks. One of them passed within 15 feet of their hiding spot. Rhett could see the man's face clearly, young, maybe 20, with a rifle he didn't look comfortable holding. The man paused, peered into the shadows where they crouched, then moved on. When the men finally gave up and rode out, Rhett let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "That was close," he said. "They'll be back." Ayla's voice was flat. "Now that they know someone's here, they'll keep coming. Then we need a plan." "I have a plan. We make them think this place is cursed." Rhett stared at her. "What?" "My people did it before. When settlers came too close to our sacred places, we'd leave signs, make noises in the night, move their things, make them think spirits were angry." A small, grim smile crossed her face. "White men are terrified of ghosts. You want to haunt them. I want to make them too scared to come back." It was ridiculous. It was also the only idea they had. That night, they crept to where the scouts had made camp at the canyon entrance. The men were asleep, only one keeping watch, and he was doing a terrible job of it, nodding off every few minutes. Rhett and Ayla moved like shadows, taking small things. A boot, a canteen, a playing card from a deck. They rearranged the camp subtly, moved saddles, turned bedrolls, hung a knife from a tree branch where it would catch moonlight. Then Ayla did something that made Rhett's skin crawl. She stood at the edge of the firelight and began to sing. Low, wordless, a sound that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. The melody was ancient, mournful, wrong in a way that bypassed reason and went straight to the back of the brain where primal fear lived. The watch woke the others. They stumbled around, grabbing weapons, shouting, but there was nothing to shoot at. The singing faded as Ayla backed into the darkness, and by the time the men had torches lit, she and Rhett were long gone. The next morning, the scouts left. Rhett watched them go, arguing with each other, glancing over their shoulders like something was following them. "Did you see their faces?" Ayla asked, grinning. "That was the most reckless thing you've ever done." "It worked, didn't it? This time. Next time they might bring more men. Men who don't scare so easily." Her grin faded. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens." But it ate at Rhett, the knowledge that they were living on borrowed time, that sooner or later Coleman would send people who wouldn't be frightened away by ghost stories. People like himself, 4 years ago, hard men who'd seen too much to be scared of shadows. 2 weeks later, they came. Rhett was hunting when he heard the gunshots. 3 quick cracks echoing through the canyon, close enough to make his heart jump into his throat. He ran back to the cave, expecting the worst, and found Ayla standing outside with a rifle he didn't know she had. "What the hell happened?" "Bounty hunters." She lowered the rifle, hand shaking slightly. 3 of them. They were climbing up to the cave. I fired warning shots." "Jesus, Ayla. Warning shots? They're bounty hunters. They don't take warnings." "I wasn't going to kill someone." "They would have killed you." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." Rhett grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "These men aren't scouts. They're professionals. They get paid to bring people in, dead or alive, and they don't care which. Warning shots just tell them where you are." She pulled away from him, angry now. "So what was I supposed to do? Let them find us? Shoot them in the back?" "If that's what it takes to survive, yes." "I'm not you, Rhett. I can't just kill people." The words hit harder than she probably meant them to. Rhett felt something crack inside him, something he'd been holding together with spit and stubbornness. "You think I like it?" he asked quietly. "You think it doesn't keep me up at night? Every man I've ever put down? I didn't choose this. I chose to survive. There's a difference." Ayla's expression softened. "I know. I'm sorry. I don't want to become someone I'm not because the world's trying to kill me. The world doesn't care who you are. It's going to try to kill you anyway. Then I'd rather die being myself than live being someone I hate." Rhett didn't have an answer for that, didn't know how to explain that survival had a cost, and sometimes that cost was the person you used to be. A sound from below interrupted them, voices rough and confident. The bounty hunters were regrouping. "We need to go," Rhett said. "Now, deeper into the canyon, somewhere they can't follow." "I'm tired of running. I'm tired of watching people I care about die." He grabbed her hand. "Please, Ayla, just this once, trust me." She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but this is the last time." They gathered what they could carry and headed into the narrow passages, the places where the canyon walls pressed so close you could touch both sides at once. Rhett led, Ayla following, and behind them he could hear the bounty hunters shouting, trying to figure out where they'd gone. The passage opened suddenly into a chamber Rhett hadn't seen before. It was massive, cathedral-like, with a shaft of sunlight coming down through a crack in the ceiling 50 feet up. Water pooled in the center, clear and still as glass. "This is it," Ayla whispered. "This is the heart place, where my grandmother brought me. It's beautiful. It's sacred." She moved to the water's edge, knelt. "This is where we came to speak to the ancestors, to ask for guidance. Can you ask them how to get out of this mess?" She actually smiled at that. They're ancestors, not miracle workers. The sound of boots on rock echoed from the passage behind them. The bounty hunters were close. Rhett pulled his revolver, checked the chambers. 6 shots, 3 men. Not great odds, but he'd worked with worse. "Stay behind me," he said. "No." "Ayla," I said no. She stood, and there was something different in her stance now. Something harder. "You're right. The world doesn't care who I am, but that doesn't mean I have to let it win without a fight." The first bounty hunter came through the passage, a tall man with a scarred face and a shotgun. He saw them and grinned. "Well, well, the runaway and her pet cowboy." He raised the shotgun. "Nothing personal, sweetheart, just business." "It's always just business with you people," Ayla said. Then she did something Rhett didn't expect. She started singing the same wordless melody she'd used to scare the scouts. But this time it was different, louder, stronger. The sound filled the chamber, bouncing off the walls, building on itself until it felt like the rock itself was singing. The bounty hunter hesitated. "What the hell is that?" "A warning," Ayla said. The other 2 bounty hunters pushed into the chamber, weapons drawn. The singing grew louder, and Rhett felt it in his bones, vibrating through the ground beneath his feet. "Shoot them," the scarred man said. But before anyone could pull a trigger, the ground shook. Not violently, just enough to notice, just enough to make the pool water ripple. The bounty hunters looked at each other, suddenly uncertain. "It's a trick," one of them said. But his voice shook. Ayla's singing rose higher, and a sound answered it, a deep groan from somewhere in the earth, like the canyon itself was waking up. "The hell with this," the third bounty hunter said, backing toward the passage. "I'm not dying in a cave for $100. He ran. The other 2 stood frozen for another moment, then followed, nearly tripping over each other in their haste to get out. When they were gone, Ayla stopped singing. The chamber fell silent. Rhett stared at her. "What was that?" She sank to her knees, trembling. "I don't know. I remembered what my grandmother taught me about how sound travels through rock, how if you hit the right frequency, the whole canyon resonates. You made them think the place was coming down." "Maybe it was." She looked at the water, at the crack of light above. Or maybe the ancestors were listening after all. Rhett holstered his gun and knelt beside her. "You all right?" "I think so." She leaned against him, exhausted. "Did I really just scare away 3 armed men with a song?" "You really did. My grandmother would be proud." "She'd be terrified. I know I am." Ayla laughed, tired, slightly hysterical, but real. "We can't stay here, can we?" "No, they'll come back. Maybe not those 3, but others. Coleman's not going to give up." "Then what do we do?" Rhett helped her to her feet. "We stop running, we stop hiding, we go to Coleman, and we end this." "How?" "I don't know yet, but I'm done letting him control our lives." He took her hand. "You said you were tired of running. So am I. Let's stand and fight." "With what? We have no leverage, no money, no proof of anything he's done. We have the truth. The truth doesn't matter to men like Coleman. Then we make it matter." They made their way back to the main cave as night fell. Rhett spent the evening checking his weapons, making plans. Ayla sat by the fire, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. You're really going to do this, she finally said. We're really going to do this. And if it doesn't work, then at least we went down swinging. He set down the revolver he'd been cleaning and looked at her. I'm tired of being afraid, tired of waiting for the next bad thing. I want to choose what happens next, even if it's choosing to fight a battle we might not win. Ayla stood and crossed to him, sat down close enough that their shoulders touched. I'm scared. Me too. But you're still going? Yeah, because scared and brave aren't opposites. They're partners. You taught me that. She leaned her head on his shoulder. I didn't teach you anything. You taught me how to stand still, how to plant seeds, even when you don't know if they'll grow, how to call down rain. He turned to kiss her forehead. You taught me that giving up isn't the same as letting go. Pretty words for a cowboy. I'm a complicated man. She smiled against his shoulder. Yes, you are. They sat like that for a long time, the fire burning low, the canyon breathing around them. Rhett thought about Caleb, about the farm they'd lost, about all the years he'd spent running from the memory of failure. He thought about the land he'd given up, the home he'd sold for Ayla's freedom, and he realized he didn't regret any of it. Not the loss, not the sacrifice, not the fear, because it had brought him here, to this moment, to this woman who sang to stones and made the earth answer. Tomorrow, he said, we ride to Fort Kearns, we face Coleman, and we finish this. Together? Together. Ayla lifted her head and kissed him, soft and slow and full of promise. When she pulled back, her eyes were steady. All right, she said, let's go remind them that we're not property, we're people. And people fight back. They slept that night, wrapped in each other's arms, the fire dying to embers, the stars wheeling overhead through the crack in the canyon ceiling. And when morning came, they woke not as fugitives or survivors, but as something else entirely. As two people who'd decided that their story wasn't going to be written by men who valued power over humanity. As two people who'd found, in each other and in the unyielding rock of the canyon, something worth fighting for. As two people who were finally, after everything, ready to stand their ground and claim the life they deserved. The ride to Fort Kearns would be dangerous. Coleman would be ready for trouble. The odds were stacked against them in every possible way. But for the first time since Caleb died, Rhett didn't care about the odds. He cared about the person riding beside him, about the seeds still waiting to grow in the hidden canyon, about the future that stretched out uncertain and terrifying and entirely theirs to shape. The canyon had given them shelter. Now it was time to see if the world outside could give them something more. Justice. Freedom. The simple right to exist without fear. Small things maybe, but worth fighting for. Worth dying for if it came to that. But more importantly, worth living for. And that made all the difference. They didn't ride straight to Fort Kearns. That would have been suicide, and Rhett had survived this long by knowing the difference between courage and stupidity. Instead, they headed back to Domingo Springs, arriving just after dawn when the town was still half asleep and less likely to ask questions. Hank was sweeping the floor of Morrison's saloon when Rhett walked in, Ayla a step behind. The bartender looked up, did a double take, and set the broom aside. Heard you were dead, Hank said. Heard wrong. Coleman's been telling people you stole territorial property and ran. Got a price on your head. $500. Rhett felt Ayla stiffen behind him. $500 for me or for both of us? You. She's worth more alive, apparently. $1,000 if someone brings her in breathing. Hank pulled 2 glasses and a bottle from under the bar without being asked. You planning to do something stupid, Calloway? Probably. Figured. He poured whiskey into both glasses, slid them across. What do you need? Information. Who's Coleman working with? Who's backing his operation? Hank glanced at Ayla, then back at Rhett. You sure you want to know? Would I be asking if I wasn't? The bartender sighed and leaned on the bar, lowering his voice even though they were alone. Coleman's got a deal with a man named Vickers. Owns a labor outfit, sends workers to railroads, mines, anywhere that needs cheap hands and doesn't ask questions. He's been buying up Apache people through Coleman's legal channels and selling them to work camps out west. That's slavery, Ayla said quietly. Territorial law calls it indentured servitude. But yeah, same difference. Hank refilled Rhett's glass. Vickers is in Santa Fe right now, negotiating a contract with the railroad, but he's got an office here in town, above the land office. Guards? 2, usually, but they're lazy, more interested in cards than watching doors. Rhett drained his glass. What about proof? Documents, ledgers, anything that shows what they're doing? If it exists, it'll be in that office. Vickers is meticulous, keeps records of everything. Hank straightened. But Calloway, even if you find proof, who are you going to show it to? The territorial governor's in Vickers' pocket. The military doesn't care. And the federal government's got bigger problems than what happens to a few Apache in the middle of nowhere. Then we'll make them care. How? Rhett didn't have an answer for that yet. He looked at Ayla, saw the determination in her eyes despite the fear underneath it, and felt his resolve harden. We'll figure it out, he said. They spent the rest of the morning watching Vickers' office from across the street, pretending to browse the general store while tracking the guards' routines. Just like Hank said, the 2 men were more interested in their card game than their job, stepping outside every hour to smoke and argue about who was cheating. We go in at shift change, Rhett said quietly. They'll be distracted, tired, less likely to notice. And if someone does notice, then we run, fast. Ayla nodded, but her hands were shaking slightly. Rhett covered one with his own. You don't have to do this, he said. You can wait here. No. She squeezed his hand. We do this together. That's what we said. Shift change came at sundown. The 2 guards were replaced by 2 others who looked even less interested in their job. Rhett and Ayla slipped around to the back of the building where an external staircase led to the 2nd floor. The door at the top was locked, but Rhett had learned a few things in his outlaw years. The lock gave way in under a minute. The office was exactly what Rhett expected. Neat, organized, soulless. A large desk dominated the center of the room. Filing cabinets lined one wall, and a safe sat in the corner behind a painting of some historical battle Rhett didn't recognize. Start with the cabinets, he whispered. Anything with dates, names, numbers. I'll check the desk. They worked quickly, quietly. Ayla pulled files and spread them on the floor, scanning for anything useful. Rhett rifled through desk drawers, finding correspondence, invoices, legal documents that made his blood boil with their casual inhumanity. Rhett. Ayla's voice was tight. Look at this. She held up a ledger. Rhett took it, tilted it toward the fading light from the window. It was a record of transactions. People bought and sold like livestock, with prices, dates, and destinations meticulously noted. He found Ayla's name halfway down one page. Purchased from Coleman for $100. Sold to a mining operation in Colorado for $800. They were going to send you to a mine, Rhett said. Ayla's face had gone pale. There are hundreds of names here, children even. Some as young as 6. Rhett felt sick. He'd known Coleman was corrupt, but this was beyond corruption. This was systematic evil, dressed up in legal language and official stamps. Take it, he said. Take all of it. Every file that shows what they're doing. They stuffed papers into a canvas bag Ayla had brought, working faster now, knowing they were running out of time. Rhett was reaching for the last drawer when he heard footsteps on the stairs outside. He froze. Met Ayla's eyes. She'd heard it too. The door handle turned. Rhett grabbed Ayla and pulled her behind the desk just as the door swung open. Through the gap between the desk and the wall, he could see boots, expensive ones, polished to a shine. Not a guard, then. Someone more important. I told you I needed those contracts by Friday, a voice said. Educated, Eastern accent. Vickers, probably. Another set of boots entered. These were scuffed, worn. Had some complications. The woman you wanted from Coleman's batch escaped. He's still trying to track her down. Rhett felt Ayla tense beside him. I don't pay Coleman for excuses, Vickers said coldly. I pay him for results. If he can't deliver, I'll find someone who can. He's got men out looking. Says he'll have her within the week. He'd better. I've got a buyer in Denver paying premium for Apache women. Says they make good house staff if you train them right. A pause. What about the cowboy she ran off with? Calloway? Dead, probably. Or will be soon. Coleman put the word out. Every bounty hunter from here to the border's looking for them. Good. Can't have people thinking they can interfere with legitimate business operations. Legitimate. The word made Rhett want to put his gun to the man's head and redefine it for him. The men moved around the office, and Rhett heard papers shuffling, a cabinet opening. They were looking for something. He and Ayla pressed tighter against the wall, trying to make themselves smaller, invisible. "Here," Vickers said, "the Santa Fe contracts. I need you to take these to Coleman tonight. Tell him I expect the next shipment ready by the end of the month." "Consider it done." The boots moved toward the door. Rhett allowed himself to breathe again. Then Ayla's foot slipped. It was a tiny sound, barely a scrape against the wooden floor. But in the quiet office, it was deafening. The footsteps stopped. "What was that?" Vickers asked. "Probably rats. Old building." "Check anyway." Rhett's hand moved to his gun. Ayla's eyes were wide, terrified. The boots came closer, around the desk, and Rhett knew they were out of time and options. He stood up, gun drawn, pointing it at a thin man in a suit who looked more annoyed than frightened. "Don't move," Rhett said. Vickers stared at him, then at Ayla rising beside him. Recognition flickered across his face. "The Apache woman," he said, "and the cowboy. Coleman said you were smarter than this." "Coleman's wrong about a lot of things." The other man, younger, harder looking, reached for his gun. Rhett swung his revolver toward him. "I wouldn't. I'm faster than I look, and I've got nothing to lose." The man froze, hand hovering over his holster. "James," Vickers said calmly. "Do as he says." James raised his hand slowly. "Good choice," Rhett said. "Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to sit in that chair." He gestured with the gun toward a wooden chair near the window. "And you're going to stay very quiet while we leave. Understand?" "You won't make it out of town," Vickers said, moving to the chair. "I have men everywhere." "Then I guess we'll have to be creative." Rhett glanced at Ayla. "Get the bag. All of it." She grabbed the canvas bag, now heavy with documents, and slung it over her shoulder. Her hands had stopped shaking. Instead, there was something fierce in her expression that Rhett had never seen before. "You know what you are?" she said to Vickers. "You're worse than the men who destroyed my people. They were cruel, but at least they didn't pretend it was business. You hide behind papers and laws and call yourself civilized while you buy and sell human beings. You're a coward." Vickers' face flushed. "You don't understand economics, girl. Someone has to do the work. Might as well be people who..." "Who what? Don't matter? Aren't really people?" Ayla stepped closer to him, and Rhett saw Vickers actually flinch. "I matter. Every person in that ledger matters. And you're going to answer for what you've done." "With what proof? Those documents are legal. Everything I do is within territorial law." "Then the law's broken," Rhett said, "and we're going to fix it." He backed toward the door, keeping the gun trained on both men. Ayla followed, and they were almost to the threshold when James made his move. The man was fast, faster than Rhett expected. He lunged, hand closing around Ayla's arm, yanking her backward. She cried out, stumbling, and the bag fell from her shoulder, papers scattering. Rhett fired. The shot was loud in the enclosed space, deafening. James screamed and fell backward, clutching his shoulder. Not a killing shot, but enough to put him down. Vickers dove behind the desk. Rhett grabbed Ayla, pulling her toward the door as shouts erupted from downstairs. "The papers," she said. "Leave them. We have to move." "No. We need proof." She dropped to her knees, frantically gathering documents while Rhett covered the door. The guards were coming up the stairs, heavy boots pounding. Rhett fired twice through the doorway, not aiming to hit, just to slow them down. It worked. The footsteps retreated. "Ayla, now!" She stuffed the last papers into the bag and they ran. Out the door, down the back stairs, into the alley behind the building. Shouts followed them, and another gunshot cracked against the wall near Rhett's head. They ran through the darkening streets, cutting through alleys, jumping fences, moving on instinct and adrenaline. Behind them, the shouts were getting organized, spreading out. "The livery," Rhett gasped. "We need horses." They made it to the stable where they'd left Ash and another horse they'd borrowed. Rhett saddled both animals in record time while Ayla kept watch at the door. "They're coming," she said. "I can hear them." Almost done. He cinched the last strap, grabbed the reins, and they mounted just as torchlight appeared at the end of the street. Rhett kicked Ash into a gallop, Ayla right behind him, and they thundered out of Domingo Springs with half the town chasing them. The pursuit lasted 3 miles before they lost them in the darkness. Rhett knew these trails, knew where the ground got rocky and tracks disappeared, knew which turns led to dead ends and which led to freedom. By the time they reached the canyon, the torches were distant fireflies behind them. They didn't stop until they were deep in the passages, back in the sacred chamber where Ayla had sung to the stone. Only then did Rhett allow himself to dismount, legs shaking, heart hammering. "That was insane," he said. Ayla slid off her horse and immediately checked the bag. The documents were crushed, some torn, but mostly intact. She pulled out the ledger, held it like it was made of gold. "We have it," she said. "We actually have it." "Yeah. Now what do we do with it?" That was the question neither of them had answered. They sat by the pool, spreading documents on the rock, and Rhett felt the weight of what they'd stolen settle on his shoulders. "Hank was right," he said. "The territorial governor won't care, the military won't care. Hell, even if we rode to Santa Fe and showed this to every official in the territory, half of them are probably getting paid by Vickers." "Then we go higher," Ayla said. "Higher than the territory." "Federal. We take it to the federal government." Rhett laughed bitterly. "You think they care any more than the territory does?" "Some of them might. There are people in Washington who've been trying to stop this kind of thing. Indian rights advocates, abolitionists who didn't stop fighting when the war ended." She looked at him. "My mother used to tell stories about a woman who traveled to Washington to speak for our people. They didn't listen to her, but maybe they'll listen to this." She held up the ledger, and Rhett saw something in her eyes that made his chest tight. Hope. Fierce, stubborn, probably foolish hope. "That's 1,000 miles away," he said quietly. "Maybe more. Through territory where we're wanted criminals, with men hunting us, with no money, no supplies, no guarantee anyone will listen even if we make it. I know. We could die trying. I know. And you still want to go?" "Yes." She set the ledger down carefully. "Because if we don't, nothing changes. Coleman keeps selling people. Vickers keeps buying them. And everyone in this ledger becomes a number that gets forgotten." Rhett looked at the documents spread around them, hundreds of names, hundreds of lives reduced to transactions. He thought about Caleb, about how his brother had died believing Rhett would do the right thing even when it was hard, about how he'd spent 4 years running from that responsibility. "All right," he said, "we go to Washington." Ayla's face lit up. "Really?" "Yeah, but we do it smart. We rest here for a few days, let the heat die down. Gather supplies. Plan a route that keeps us off main roads." He picked up the ledger. "And we make copies of this. Hide them in different places. Because if something happens to us, someone needs to know what's in here." They spent the next 3 days preparing. Rhett hunted, dried meat, filled water skins. Ayla carefully copied the most damning pages of the ledger, her handwriting small and precise. They hid one copy deep in the cave system, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into a crevice that would survive floods and fires. Another they sent with a message to Hank, asking him to hold it until they returned or until news came that they wouldn't be returning. On the morning of the 4th day, they were ready. The horses were rested, the bags packed, and Rhett had cleaned and loaded every weapon they owned, 2 revolvers, a rifle, and a knife that Ayla wore strapped to her calf. They were saddling the horses when they heard it. Hoofbeats. A lot of them. Coming fast. Rhett and Ayla looked at each other. They'd been careful, covered their tracks, stayed hidden, but somehow, someone had found them. "How many?" Ayla asked. Rhett listened. 8, maybe 10. "We can't outrun that many." "No." He checked his revolver, felt the familiar weight of it in his hand. "But we can try." They mounted and rode deeper into the canyon, looking for high ground, defensible positions, anything that would give them an advantage. The hoofbeats got closer, echoing off the rock walls, making it impossible to tell exactly where they were coming from. Rhett spotted an outcropping, a shelf of rock about 20 feet up with a narrow path leading to it. Good sight lines, limited approach. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than being caught in the open. "Up there," he said. They dismounted and scrambled up the path, leading the horses. Rhett took position behind a boulder, rifle ready. Ayla crouched beside him, her own rifle, the one she'd fired at the bounty hunters, gripped tight. The riders appeared, 10 of them, led by Coleman himself. The territorial officer sat his horse like he owned the world, that same cold smile on his face. Calloway, Coleman's voice boomed through the canyon. I know you're up there. Come down. Let's talk like reasonable men. Last time we talked, you tried to sell my wife, Rhett called back. Wife? Coleman laughed. You married the property? That's rich. Beside Rhett, Ayla went rigid. He could feel fury radiating off her. She's not property, Rhett said. She's a person. And yeah, we got married. Legal and everything. That wasn't true. Not yet. But it would be if they survived this. Coleman's smile faded. Doesn't matter what you call her. The law says the law is wrong. Maybe, but it's still the law, and I enforce it. Coleman gestured to his men. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and you've got nowhere to run. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to come down, hand over whatever papers you stole from Vickers' office, and the woman is going to come with me. Do that, and I'll make sure you hang quick instead of slow. That's a generous offer, Rhett said. Here's mine. You ride out of here, tell Vickers his operation is done, and maybe you get to keep breathing. How's that sound? Coleman laughed again. You've got guts, Calloway. Stupid, but guts. He raised his hand. Boys, persuade them. The men raised their rifles. Rhett fired first. His shot took the hat off one of the men, and everyone scattered for cover. Gunfire erupted, bullets pinging off rock, ricocheting through the canyon. Ayla fired too. Steady, controlled. Better than Rhett expected. She hit one man in the leg, and he went down screaming. But there were too many of them, and they had too much ammunition. For every shot Rhett and Ayla fired, 3 came back. Rock chips flew. Dust filled the air. Rhett's ears rang from the noise. We can't hold this position, he shouted over the gunfire. Where do we go? Good question. Below them, Coleman's men were spreading out, trying to flank their position. Behind them was nothing but canyon wall. They were trapped. A bullet cracked past Rhett's head, close enough that he felt the heat. He returned fire, dropped another man, but his rifle clicked empty. He grabbed his revolver, but it only had 6 shots left, and there were still 8 men down there. Then the sky opened up. Not rain. Not this time. Thunder, a deep rolling sound that came from everywhere and nowhere, shaking the ground beneath them. The horses screamed and reared. Coleman's men looked around wildly, trying to find the source. Rhett looked at Ayla. She'd set down her rifle and was standing, arms raised, singing that same wordless song she'd used in the sacred chamber. What are you doing? He shouted. Finishing this, she shouted back. The sound grew louder, the canyon walls trembled, and then, impossibly, water came. Not from the sky, from the canyon itself. A wall of water surged down the stream bed, flash flood, moving like a living thing, churning and roaring and unstoppable. Coleman saw it and screamed a warning, but it was too late. The water hit his men like a fist, sweeping horses and riders downstream. Rhett watched in stunned silence as the flood carved through the canyon floor, erasing everything in its path. When it finally subsided, only 2 men were left standing, Coleman and one of his riders. The rest were gone, swept away or pinned under debris. Coleman stared up at their position, face pale, eyes wide. What the hell are you? Ayla lowered her arms. She was trembling, exhausted, but her voice was steady. I'm the granddaughter of the canyon's keeper, and this place remembers. Coleman's remaining man turned his horse and fled. Coleman watched him go, then looked back at Rhett and Ayla. This isn't over, he said. Yeah, Rhett replied. It is. He raised his revolver and fired. Not to kill, just close enough to make Coleman's horse bolt. The territorial officer tried to hold on, failed, and hit the ground hard. By the time he got to his feet, Rhett and Ayla were mounting their horses. They rode past him, close enough that Rhett could see the rage and fear warring in Coleman's eyes. Tell Vickers we're coming for him, Rhett said. Tell him the canyon remembers. And so do we. Then they were gone, riding east toward a future that was uncertain and dangerous, but finally theirs to choose. Behind them, Coleman stood alone in the scarred canyon, surrounded by the wreckage of his ambition, and for the first time in his miserable life, he understood what it felt like to lose. They rode for 3 days straight, stopping only when the horses needed rest or when exhaustion forced them to make camp in whatever cover they could find. Rhett kept expecting to hear hoofbeats behind them, kept glancing over his shoulder at empty horizon, but the pursuit never came. Either Coleman had given up, or he was licking his wounds and planning something worse. Rhett didn't know which scared him more. On the fourth day, they reached a small town called Bitter Creek, nothing more than a handful of buildings clustered around a dried-up stream bed. They needed supplies, needed news, needed to know if their faces were on wanted posters yet. Rhett went in alone while Ayla stayed hidden with the horses in a copse of cottonwoods outside town. The general store was run by an old woman with sharp eyes and sharper opinions. She looked Rhett up and down when he walked in, taking in his trail-worn clothes and the dust caked on his boots. "Help you?" she asked. "Need supplies, jerky, hardtack, coffee, if you've got it, ammunition too." She gathered the items without comment, piling them on the counter. When Rhett went to pay, she stopped him with a bony hand on his wrist. "You're him, aren't you? The one they're talking about." Rhett's hand moved toward his gun. "Don't know what you mean." "The cowboy who married the Apache woman, who stood up to Coleman." She smiled, showing teeth that had seen better decades. "Word travels fast out here, and not everyone thinks what Coleman does is right. You got a point?" "My point is, you've got friends you don't know about." She pushed the supplies toward him. "No charge, and there's a back door if you need to leave quiet-like." Rhett stared at her. "Why help me?" "Because Coleman came through here 6 months ago. Took my granddaughter, said she had Apache blood, which was a lie. But who's going to argue with a badge and a gun? Haven't seen her since." The old woman's eyes went hard. "So yeah, I'm helping you, and I hope you make that bastard pay." Rhett took the supplies throat tight. "I'm sorry about your granddaughter. Being sorry doesn't bring her back, but stopping Coleman might stop it happening to someone else's granddaughter." She waved him toward the back. "Go, before someone less friendly sees you." He left through the back door and returned to where Ayla waited. When he told her about the old woman, Ayla's expression went distant. "There are others," she said quietly. "People like her, people who've lost someone to Coleman and Vickers. We're not alone in this. Doesn't mean they can help us. Maybe not, but it means what we're doing matters to more than just us." She looked at him. "That makes it worth it, doesn't it?" Rhett thought about the old woman's face, about the granddaughter she'd never see again, about all the names in that ledger, all the lives reduced to numbers and prices. "Yeah," he said. "It does." They pushed east, avoiding main roads, keeping to game trails and forgotten paths that Ayla seemed to navigate by instinct. They traded the horses for fresh ones in a town where nobody asked questions as long as you had money. They slept in caves and abandoned line shacks, under stars so thick they looked like spilled salt. And slowly, over days that turned into weeks, something shifted between them. The fear didn't go away. It couldn't, not while they were fugitives carrying evidence that could destroy powerful men, but it got quieter, pushed into the background by something stronger. They talked during the long rides, about everything and nothing, about Ayla's mother teaching her to read the weather and the flight of birds, about Caleb's terrible singing voice and worse jokes, about the future they might have if they survived this, about the children they might raise who would know both their stories and carry both their names. One night, camped in a valley where wildflowers grew thick despite the dry season, Rhett asked the question that had been gnawing at him since the canyon. "How did you do it? The flood? That wasn't natural?" Ayla was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. "My grandmother used to say the land speaks to those who listen, that water knows where it wants to go, and if you ask it properly, it'll come." She looked at him. "I don't know if I called the flood or if the canyon sent it. Maybe both. Maybe the land was tired of men like Coleman desecrating it. You believe that? That the land has will? I believe everything's connected. The rock, the water, the sky, us. And I believe that when you spend enough time listening, you start to hear what the world's trying to tell you." She smiled faintly. "My grandmother could call rain in a drought, could make crops grow in dead soil. People said she was blessed. She said she just paid attention. And you paid attention. I had a good teacher." The smile faded. "I just wish she could have taught me more before she died. There's so much I don't remember. Songs I only know parts of, stories I heard once and forgot." Rhett moved closer, put his arm around her shoulders. "Then we'll figure out the rest together. Write down what you remember. Learn what we don't know. Make new stories." "You really think we'll get that chance?" "I have to. Otherwise, what are we doing this for?" She leaned into him, and they sat like that while the fire burned low and the night grew cold. Above them, a shooting star streaked across the sky, bright and brief and beautiful. "Make a wish," Ayla said. "I thought you didn't believe in that kind of thing." "I don't. But it doesn't hurt to try." Rhett closed his eyes and wished for something simple, for them to survive, for the chance to build something that lasted, for Ayla to smile without the shadow of loss behind it. When he opened his eyes, she was watching him. "What did you wish for?" she asked. "Can't tell you. It won't come true." "That's superstition." "Maybe. But like you said, doesn't hurt to try." She kissed him then, soft and slow, tasting like coffee and smoke and hope. When they finally pulled apart, Rhett realized his hands were shaking. "We should get married," he said. "For real, I mean. Not just words I said to make Coleman angry." Ayla blinked. "That's your proposal? We should get married?" "I'm not good at this." "Clearly." But she was smiling. "Yes." "Yes?" "Yes, we should get married. When we get to Washington. When this is over. When we're not running for our lives." She took his hand. "Deal?" "Deal." They kept riding east through territories that got greener and wetter as they went, through towns that got bigger and more crowded, through a world that felt increasingly foreign to Rhett. He'd spent years in the empty spaces, the forgotten corners, the places where you could disappear. This was the opposite. Too many people, too much noise, too many eyes. But Ayla navigated it all with a calm determination that amazed him. She'd spent her whole life as an outsider, and somehow that made her better at blending in than Rhett ever was. She knew when to keep her head down, when to smile, when to let her Apache features show, and when to hide them under a bonnet and shawl. They reached St. Louis in late summer, the Mississippi River vast and brown and smelling like civilization. Rhett had been here once before, years ago, running from something he couldn't quite remember. It looked the same. Crowded docks, tall buildings, people moving with purpose and speed that made his head spin. "How far to Washington?" Ayla asked, staring at a map they'd bought from a street vendor. "Another week, maybe, if we can catch a train." "Can we afford it?" Rhett counted the money they had left, what he'd earned selling their spare horse, what Ayla had made mending clothes for travelers they'd met on the road. Barely enough. "We'll make it work," he said. They bought the cheapest tickets they could find, third-class passage on a train that rattled like it was held together with prayers. The other passengers were immigrants mostly, families heading east for factory work, old men with weathered faces who looked like they'd worked their whole lives and had nothing to show for it. Ayla sat by the window watching the landscape blur past, fields and forests and towns that all started to look the same. Rhett sat beside her, one hand on the canvas bag that held the ledger and documents, hyper-aware of every person who walked past their compartment. "You think they'll listen?" Ayla asked quietly. "When we get there. You think anyone will actually care?" "I don't know, but we have to try." "And if they don't? If we traveled all this way for nothing?" Rhett didn't have a good answer for that. He'd been trying not to think about it, about the possibility that they'd risk everything only to be ignored or dismissed or arrested. "Then at least we'll know we tried," he finally said. "And maybe someone will care. Maybe not today, but someday. Someone will read these documents and know what happened and do something about it." "That's optimistic for you. You're rubbing off on me." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Rhett squeezed her hand, and they rode in silence as the train carried them toward whatever waited in Washington. The capital was overwhelming. Rhett had never seen so many buildings, so many people, so much concentrated power in one place. The streets were paved, the buildings made of stone and marble, everything designed to impress and intimidate. They found a boarding house that would take them despite Ayla's appearance, run by a widow who looked like she'd seen enough of life not to judge. Rhett paid for a week in advance, and they holed up in a tiny room on the third floor, planning their next move. "We need to find someone who'll listen," Ayla said, spreading the documents on the bed. "Someone with actual authority. The question is who? Everyone here's connected to someone else. We picked the wrong person, and we might as well hand ourselves over to Coleman." They spent 2 days asking careful questions, talking to clerks and secretaries, trying to figure out who in the vast government machinery might care about what was happening in a distant territory most people had never heard of. Finally, a name emerged. Senator Margaret Brennan, representing Massachusetts, known for her work on Indian affairs and labor reform. She'd been fighting for federal oversight of territorial governments for years, making enemies in the process. "She's our best shot," Rhett said, reading a newspaper article about one of her speeches. "Maybe our only shot." Getting to see her was harder. They tried the official channels first, wrote letters, requested meetings, waited in offices where board clerks told them the senator was very busy and didn't have time for walk-ins. After a week of getting nowhere, Rhett decided to try a different approach. He waited outside the senator's house at dawn, and when she emerged to enter her carriage, he stepped into her path. "Senator Brennan, I need 5 minutes of your time." 2 men in suits, bodyguards or aides, Rhett couldn't tell, moved to intercept him, but Brennan held up a hand, stopping them. She was older than her photographs suggested, maybe 60, with iron gray hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen through every lie ever told. "You have 1 minute to tell me why I shouldn't have you arrested," she said. Rhett pulled the ledger from his coat and held it out. "Because this proves that territorial officers in New Mexico are running a slave trade under the guise of legal authority, and if you don't stop it, it's going to keep happening." Brennan took the ledger, flipped it open, scanned a page. Her expression didn't change, but something hardened in her eyes. "Where did you get this?" "Stole it from the man doing the buying. Coleman and Vickers, they're—" "I know who they are." She looked up at him. "Are you Rhett Calloway?" Rhett's stomach dropped. "You've heard of me. There's a warrant for your arrest. Multiple counts of theft, assault, and kidnapping an Apache woman." She glanced past him to where Ayla stood at the edge of the street. "That her?" "She's not kidnapped. She's my wife. And those charges are lies told by the same men who are selling people." "Can you prove that?" "That's what the ledger's for." Brennan studied him for a long moment, then looked at her guards. "Let him pass. Both of them. They're coming inside." The next 3 hours were the most intense of Rhett's life. Brennan sat them down in her study and went through every document they'd brought, asking sharp questions, taking notes, cross-referencing names and dates. Ayla did most of the talking, her voice steady as she explained the auction, the holding facilities at Fort Kearns, the network of buyers that stretched from New Mexico to Colorado to California. When they finished, Brennan sat back in her chair, face grim. "This is worse than I thought," she said. "I knew territorial governments were corrupt, but this is systematic trafficking backed by official sanction." "Can you stop it?" Rhett asked. "I can try. I'll bring this before the Senate, demand an investigation, but it won't be fast and it won't be easy. These men have friends in high places." "How long?" "Months, maybe years. The government moves slowly, Mr. Calloway, even when it wants to move." Ayla's shoulders sagged. Rhett felt his own hope deflating. "In the meantime," Brennan continued, "you two need to disappear. Coleman has friends in Washington too. The moment he knows you're here, you're in danger." "We didn't come all this way to hide," Ayla said. "You came to make a difference. You have. Now, let me do my job while you stay alive to see it through." Brennan stood. "I have a property in upstate New York, a farm, mostly unused. You can stay there, work the land, keep your heads down. When this is over, when it's safe, I'll send for you." "And what do we do until then?" Rhett asked. "Just wait? You build a life. You take care of each other. You survive." Brennan's expression softened slightly. "You've done something brave coming here. Don't waste it by getting yourselves killed before justice can be served." They left Washington 3 days later, carrying papers that identified them as John and Mary Fletcher, tenant farmers working land owned by Senator Brennan. The papers were solid enough to pass casual inspection, fragile enough to fall apart under real scrutiny. The farm was exactly what Brennan had described: 100 acres in a valley surrounded by low hills, with a stone house that had good bones but needed work, a barn that needed more work, and fields that hadn't been planted in years. It reminded Rhett painfully of the canyon property he'd sold, but it was also different, greener, wetter, full of possibility instead of just stubborn survival. "What do you think?" he asked Ayla as they stood looking at the overgrown fields. "I think it's a lot of work." "That's not an answer." She turned to him, and for the first time in months, she looked genuinely peaceful. "I think it could be home, if we make it one." They spent the fall cleaning, repairing, preparing. Rhett fixed the barn roof, mended fences, cleared brush. Ayla planted a garden, Not the desperate, hopeful planting of the canyon, but something bigger, more ambitious. She used the seeds she'd saved, mixed with new ones she bought from a local farmer who didn't ask too many questions. They found a minister who married them on a cold October afternoon. No witnesses except the man's wife and a cat that watched from the windowsill. Rhett kissed Ayla in front of the fireplace in that stranger's house and thought about how far they'd come from the auction block in Domingo Springs. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Mr. Calloway," she replied, smiling. Winter came hard and early. They spent the dark months inside, keeping the fire going, reading books Ayla bought from town, teaching each other things they'd never learned. Ayla taught Rhett some of her language, the words her grandmother had taught her. Rhett taught Ayla to play cards, though she was better at it than he'd ever be. They talked about the future, about children, maybe, about what they'd do when Coleman was arrested and Vickers shut down, about going back to the canyon someday, to the sacred places where Ayla's ancestors had left their marks. "Do you miss it?" Rhett asked one night. "The canyon? Every day. But I miss what it represented more than the place itself." She looked at him across the table, her face warm in the firelight. "The canyon was where I learned I could fight back, where I learned I mattered. But I don't need the canyon for that anymore. I have you, and I have this." She gestured around the small house. "This is ours. Nobody can take it from us. Coleman could try. Let him. He doesn't scare me anymore." Rhett reached across the table and took her hand. "You're braver than anyone I've ever met." "No, I'm just tired of being afraid. There's a difference." Spring came slowly, grudgingly, but it came. They planted corn, beans, squash, the three sisters, Ayla called them, the crops her people had grown for generations. They planted apple trees that wouldn't bear fruit for years but would live longer than either of them. They planted roots, both literal and metaphorical. The letter from Senator Brennan arrived in June. Rhett saw the official seal and his hand started shaking before he'd even opened it. Ayla stood beside him, reading over his shoulder as he unfolded the page. The investigation had taken 8 months. Brennan had gathered testimony from dozens of people, including the old woman from Bitter Creek, who'd traveled all the way to Washington to tell her story. She'd subpoenaed records, cross-referenced documents, built a case so airtight that even Coleman's friends in the government couldn't ignore it. Coleman had been arrested, stripped of his badge, charged with trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy. He was awaiting trial in a federal prison. Vickers was ruined, his business seized, his assets frozen, his contracts canceled. Some of his buyers had been arrested too. Others had fled. And most importantly, the territorial laws that had allowed the whole operation to exist were being challenged. Brennan was pushing for federal oversight, for protections, for recognition that what had happened was wrong and couldn't be allowed to continue. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't bring back the people who'd been sold, the lives that had been destroyed. But it was something. It was justice, incomplete and imperfect, but real. Rhett set down the letter and looked at Ayla. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "We did it," she said. "You did it. You're the one who wouldn't give up. We did it together." She took his hand, just like everything else. They stood there in the kitchen of their small house, holding each other, and Rhett felt something loosen in his chest that had been clenched tight since Caleb died. Not forgiveness, exactly. The guilt would always be there, would always be part of him. But maybe that was okay. Maybe you didn't have to be free of guilt to move forward. Maybe you just had to decide it wasn't going to be the only thing that defined you. The trial was set for August. Brennan wanted them to testify, but she left the choice to them. It would mean going back, facing Coleman, reliving everything. It would mean putting themselves in danger again. They talked about it for days, weighed the risks against the need for closure, for facing down the man who tried to own them. In the end, they went. The courtroom in Santa Fe was packed. Rhett saw faces he recognized. Hank from Morrison's Saloon, the old woman from Bitter Creek, people who'd been touched by Coleman's operation in one way or another. He saw Gades, the auctioneer, sitting in shackles next to Vickers. He saw Coleman himself, looking older and smaller than Rhett remembered, stripped of his badge and authority and reduced to just another criminal in a cage. When it was Ayla's turn to testify, she walked to the stand with her head high and her voice steady. She told her story without embellishment or emotion, just facts, dates, names. She described the auction, the holding cell at Fort Kearns, the ledger that proved everything. Coleman's lawyer tried to break her down, suggested she was lying, that she'd gone willingly, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. Isla looked him dead in the eye and said, "I was bought like livestock, kept in chains, sold to a man who would have worked me to death in a mine. If that's a misunderstanding, then your understanding is broken." The courtroom erupted. The judge had to call for order. When Rhett testified, he kept it simple. Told the truth about buying Ayla's freedom, about finding the ledger, about the flood in the canyon that had saved their lives. He didn't mention the supernatural parts, didn't think anyone would believe them anyway. Coleman's lawyer tried to paint him as a criminal, a troublemaker, a man with a history of violence. Rhett didn't deny it. "Yeah, I've done things I'm not proud of. Stolen, fought, ran from the law. But I never sold another human being, never pretended evil was legal just because I could make money from it. So if you want to compare my crimes to his, go ahead. See which one the jury thinks is worse." The verdict came down 3 days later. Guilty on all counts. Coleman got 20 years, Vickers got 15, Geddes got 10. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them, asking questions, wanting statements. Rhett pushed through them, Ayla's hand tight in his, until they reached the edge of the crowd where Brennan was waiting. "You did well in there," the senator said. "Doesn't feel like we did enough," Ayla replied. "You exposed a system that's been operating in shadow for decades. You gave voice to people who had none. That's more than most people do in a lifetime." Brennan smiled. "The farm's still yours if you want it. No strings. It's the least I can do." "We want it," Rhett said. "Thank you." They left Santa Fe that afternoon, riding the train back east, watching the landscape change from desert to grassland to forest. Rhett found himself relaxing for the first time in what felt like years, the weight of what they'd carried finally lifting. "What are you thinking about?" Ayla asked. "The future. What we're going to do with it. And I think we're going to be all right." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Yeah, I think so too." They returned to the farm in early autumn, just as the corn was ready for harvest. Rhett had hired a local man to watch the place while they were gone, and he'd done a good job. The fields were healthy, the house intact, everything waiting for them like they'd never left. That night, they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the hills, and Rhett thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. The auction block, the canyon, the flood, the ride to Washington, the trial. All of it connected, one thing leading to another, choices and consequences and luck and stubbornness weaving together into something that looked almost like fate. But it wasn't fate. Fate implied they hadn't had a choice. And the truth was, they'd made choices every step of the way. Some good, some bad, all of them human and imperfect and real. "I've been thinking," Ayla said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about what comes next." "Yeah?" "I want to write it down. All of it, everything that happened, so people know, so it's not just forgotten." "You think anyone will care?" "Maybe not now, but someday. Someone will find it and read it and know that we fought back, that we didn't just accept what they tried to do to us." She looked at him. "Will you help me?" "I'm not much of a writer." "You don't have to be. You just have to remember." So they did. Over the months and years that followed, they wrote it down. Her perspective and his, two sides of the same story, filling journals that they kept in a trunk under their bed. They wrote about the fear and the courage, the mistakes and the victories, the moments of doubt and the moments of certainty. They wrote about Caleb and Ayla's grandmother, about the people they'd lost and the ways those losses had shaped them. They wrote about Coleman and Vickers and Brennan, about the systems that enabled cruelty and the people who fought against them. And they wrote about each other, about learning to trust, about building something from nothing, about love that wasn't perfect or easy but was real and earned and worth every sacrifice they'd made. The farm prospered, not quickly, not spectacularly, but steadily. They added livestock, expanded the garden, built a larger barn. Neighbors came to trust them, and some even became friends. The Fletcher name stuck, and after a while, Rhett almost forgot it wasn't really his. 3 years after the trial, Ayla gave birth to a daughter. They named her Elena, which meant light, because she was born at dawn and because they wanted her to illuminate the world in ways they never could. 5 years after that, a son arrived. They named him Caleb. Rhett held his son for the first time and cried in a way he hadn't cried since his brother died. Ayla understood without him having to explain. She always did. They raised their children with stories. Stories of the canyon and the flood, stories of resistance and survival, stories of their grandmother's people and their uncle's laughter. They taught them to be proud of where they came from, all of it, the Apache and the Irish, the canyon and the farm, the hard choices and the hope that came after. One autumn, when Elena was 10 and Caleb was 5, Rhett took them to the canyon. It was the first time he'd been back since they'd fled, and he didn't know what to expect. Part of him worried it would all be gone, erased by time or development or just the indifference of the world. But the canyon was still there, still red and vast and breathing. The caves were exactly where they'd left them, the sacred chamber unchanged, the marks on the walls still visible. Isla stood in that chamber and sang the old songs, and her children listened with wide eyes as her voice filled the space and made the stones hum. Then she taught them the songs, passing them down the way her grandmother had passed them to her. "This is where we come from," she told them. "This is where we learn to fight, to survive, to love. Remember it." They planted new seeds in the terraces they'd built so many years ago. They wouldn't be there to tend them, but maybe someone else would find them someday. Maybe they'd grow wild and strong, a reminder that life persists even in the hardest places. As they rode away from the canyon for the last time, Elena asked, "Papa, are you sad to leave?" Rhett thought about it. About the land he'd sold, the cabin he'd built, the life he'd tried to have there. About Caleb and all the what-ifs that still haunted quiet moments. "No," he said finally. "I'm grateful. That place taught me how to live. But it's not where I belong anymore." "Where do you belong?" He looked at Ayla riding beside him, at his children, at the path leading east toward home. "With you. With all of you. Wherever we are together, that's where I belong." Rhett Calloway lived to be 73 years old. Ayla lived to be 71. They died within 6 months of each other, which surprised no one who knew them. They were buried on their farm, under the apple trees they'd planted that first spring, the trees that had grown tall and strong and bore fruit every year without fail. Their children inherited the farm and the journals. Elena became a teacher, using the story of her parents to educate others about the injustices that had been committed and the importance of fighting back. Caleb became a lawyer, specializing in Indian rights, carrying on the work Brennan had started. The journals were eventually donated to a library, where they sat in archives for decades before a historian found them and recognized their value. They were published, studied, cited in books about the territorial period and the fight for civil rights. And people read them. Not millions, but enough. Enough to know what had happened. Enough to remember that even in the darkest times, there were people who refused to accept injustice as normal. People who fought back with whatever tools they had: courage, stubbornness, love. The canyon remains. The water still flows, though not as strong as it once did. The caves are protected now, sacred sites that can't be developed or destroyed. And if you know where to look, you can still see the handprints on the walls, the marks left by people who wanted the world to know they'd existed, that they'd mattered, that they'd been here. Because that's what it comes down to in the end. Not the grand gestures or the historic victories, but the simple insistence on being seen, on being counted, on refusing to disappear just because someone with power decided you should. Rhett and Ayla weren't heroes. They were survivors who made mistakes and carried guilt, and sometimes chose wrong. But they also chose to stand when it would have been easier to run, to fight when it would have been safer to hide, to build when everything around them was falling apart. They chose each other. They chose hope. They chose to believe that the future could be different than the past, even when all the evidence suggested otherwise. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can do. Make our stand, tell our truth, plant our seeds, and trust that something will grow from it. Maybe redemption isn't about erasing what we've done wrong, but about doing right despite it. About moving forward with our scars instead of being paralyzed by them. The canyon taught them that. The land remembers everything: the violence and the healing, the taking and the giving, the death and the stubborn, impossible return of life. It holds it all without judgment, waiting for those who'll listen. And if you're quiet enough, if you're willing to sit with the discomfort and the uncertainty and the weight of history, you might hear what it's trying to tell you. That nothing is permanent, that everything changes, that water finds a way, seeds split stone, And people who were told they didn't matter can reshape the world just by refusing to believe it. That's the story Rhett and Ayla left behind. Not a perfect one, not a simple one, but true in the ways that matter. And truth, however uncomfortable, however incomplete, is always worth preserving. Because someone, someday, will need to know that resistance is possible, that love is stronger than law when law is unjust, that two people with nothing but conviction and each other can stand against systems designed to crush them and still come out breathing. The canyon knows. The water knows. The stone walls hold the memory. And now, so do you.